this video, we're going to talk about a time period in Europe called the Middle Ages. Sometimes it's also referred to as the medieval period. Other times it's referred to as the Dark Ages. We're actually going to talk about what's going on in Europe during this time period, and we'll touch briefly on something that's happening in Japan around the same time, because there is a connection, even though it seems a little strange. Okay? So in order for us to talk about what's happening in Europe during the Middle Ages, which refers to the time period of 500 to about 1200 AD or CE. So let's talk about what comes just before the Middle Ages, or just before medieval times in Europe. If you remember last unit, we learned about the Roman Empire, an empire that grew to be an immense size, Europe, Asia, and even Northern Africa. It was referred to as the donut, right? Circled the Mediterranean Sea. At its height, it was powerful. It experienced a golden age, but we also learned that it came to an end. Now, this was due to many factors, if you recall. Some internal, some things happening within the empire that made it collapse, and some things happening outside the empire that caused it to collapse. For all those reasons, Rome eventually is going to kind of fall apart. But we have to think about this. What happens to the people, the average citizens living in the Roman Empire, when it collapses? Well, the whole purpose of a government, or one of its major functions, is to make sure that citizens are protected. And if your empire is falling apart and you're having issues with military and things like that, how is it possible that you can keep things together and keep your citizens protected? They really wouldn't rely on the government anymore at all. So, what are they to do? See, it's all about survival. And for people in Europe during this time, survival was not certain. They had these Germanic tribes, outside forces trying to conquer and pillage and take over. So they came up with their own solution, their own means for survival. And this took shape in the form of kingdoms. Now I know you've heard this word before. The map changes. Instead of Rome being one big donut around the Mediterranean Sea, it kind of fractures and it becomes many separate little kingdoms. Now if you look at the map here, it shows you kind of big chunks of kingdoms, but even within those chunks there were smaller sections of kingdoms. Within those small pieces developed something called the manor system. A manor was basically a piece of land where people lived and were self-sufficient. The focal point of the manor was the castle, or the manor house. This is where the high-ranking family who kind of owned the manor would live. If you were living in the manor house, you were doing really well. And the only people who lived in there were the nobles, or the higher-ups that owned that manor. Another important part of the manor was the church. Every manor had a church. Most of the time it was centrally located and really tall. It was almost symbolic of how important it was to their lifestyle. You would also see fields in a manor system. Not just one, but many. Some for the cattle, some to grow one kind of crop, one to grow another. You would also have houses where the people who would work these fields would live. They wouldn't live in the manor house. They'd have their own separate places. You'd also have little workshops. You might have a blacksmith shop. You might have what is essentially a bakery or a baker's house, or maybe you'd have a workshop that made tools. The point was, everything that you needed in order to survive would be found on that manor. If you wanted a BLT, you could make the bread there, you'd have the pigs to slaughter for your bacon, and you'd grow the tomatoes in your field. Now that's just a silly example, but everything you needed for life, whether it was food or clothing or tools, you could make on that manor. We call this self-sufficiency, or being self-sufficient. A manor, the whole piece of land, this estate, was self-sufficient. It could take care of itself and it didn't need any outside help. That's good for survival for the Europeans, at least at this time, because remember, they were being attacked and invaded by outsiders. Their way of life was kind of being destroyed. They don't want to take the risk of going out and trading anymore, so they make everything themselves. Part of that was part of the reason why the manor system develops, is because of survival. Now we have to talk about the kinds of people who lived on a manor. Who were they? Let's take a look at this image. I don't want you to pay attention to the arrows so much that show you up and down between the levels of the hierarchy. I just want you to pay attention to the pictures of the people so you get a sense for who lived there. Okay? At the very top of the hierarchy, you have a king. and or a queen. They were the ones who owned the piece of land. Okay? Just below them, you have lords. They are the nobles. People that are royalty, but not obviously quite the level of the king. You'll also see members of the clergy here, people wearing what look like religious outfits. So people who were part of the Roman Catholic Church, and whether they were priests or bishops. Just below them were the knights. Lots of pop culture about knights. Knights were basically the warriors of the time period. They were the people who were, their job was to protect the manor, to protect the lords, to protect the people who lived on the manor. They're known for wearing that heavy-duty armor, riding horses. That's a key part of being a knight. You're mounted on horseback, and that's how you would fight and travel. Just below knights on the hierarchy, we have everyone else. So that would be people who are peasants or serfs. Now, serf is a new term for us. A serf is basically a peasant, but it's a peasant that is tied to the land. Now, I don't mean physically tied, chained up. What I mean is they were connected to the land. Their family had lived there and worked that land for generations, and they were not allowed to leave that land. Another king came and conquered that kingdom, conquered that manor. The serfs wouldn't go with the conquered king. They would stay on that land and work for the new king. Now, serfs, being at that lowest level, didn't have many rights at all. In fact, they had to ask permission to leave the manor, which they didn't do often, or even to get married. Everything had to be approved by the higher-ups who were in charge of the manor that they lived on. Now, there is an element of survival to this feudal hierarchy as well. Feudalism is the word that we give the contract or the relationship that exists between people who live on the manor throughout Europe. You'll see some other terms here. So, for example, next to king, it'll say /shogun/emperor. Those words are referring to the same positions, but in a different part of the world. Japan is actually developing feudalism, or a feudal system, around the same time as Europe. Now, they didn't have any contact with each other, but a very similar system is going to develop. So you'll see up here the terms, not just for the European levels of the hierarchy, but what they were called in Japan as well. At the top we have the king, and the arrow points downward to the level of lords or vassals, or in Japan they were called daimyo. That arrow points down and it says the word land next to it. That means that kings gave land to the lords, or in Japan the shoguns gave land to the daimyo. If we keep moving down, the lords would give land to the knights or the warriors, or in Japan they were called samurai. Lastly, what could the knights give to the lowest level? There was something that peasants and serfs got out of this. Even though they were the lowest level of the hierarchy and didn't have many rights, they did get something out of this contract. They would get protection. Right? By living on this land, they were promised that they would be protected. But now let's work our way up the hierarchy. Let's look at the arrows on the left-hand side. Peasants and serfs, or slaves, in either Europe or Japan, would give food and goods to the knights. The peasants were the ones who were working the land and farming the land and taking care of the animals and making the tools, and any of the hard labor that had to be done was done by this level. Peasants and serfs would produce goods and food to give to the knights. The knights would provide protection for the lords, and the lords would provide protection to the king. We call this relationship not just a hierarchy, but it's also called the feudal contract. It was an understanding that from the top level down, they would provide protection, and from the bottom up, they provide loyalty. Think about what this has to do with survival now. If you're a serf and you really have no means of protecting yourself, you're more willing to go into a bargain like this. Even though your life might not be great, you're getting certain guarantees that you and your family are going to be safe and protected during this really rough time in European history. That's all for this video. See you next time.